everyone, welcome to Risk Roundup. Proving singularity of nature scientifically was difficult to prove so far. The reason behind that is the limited knowledge and understanding we had about evolutionary biology that proved it very difficult to connect and merge biology with physics. However, with the realization that biology can now be traced to its very origin by simply reducing evolutionary biology to cell signaling, the barriers to understanding science evolution have been slowly crumbling. As a result, the ongoing reduction of biology to cellular networks and cell signaling brings a lot of promise as it gives us an understanding of the role of quantum mechanics and allow us to empirically formulate the basis for the singularity of the nature for the very first time. Moreover, with category theory now being widely used as universal modeling tool to resolve complex problems not only in physics, engineering, and design, but also life sciences, we are getting closer to understanding the complex evolutionary processes and be able to comprehend the singularity of nature. To discuss the singularity of nature further, I'm honored to welcome Professor John S. Torday to Risk Roundup. Professor Torday is a development physiologist from UCLA and with a strong interest in how and why physiology has evolved. He believes that the way to make biology and medicine rational and predictive is by reducing evolution to cell biology, as shown in his book Evolutionary Biology, Cell Communication, and Complex Disease. Welcome, Professor Torday. We are so very honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And yeah, so hopefully at the end of this session, maybe there'll be some consensus or at least questions and answers. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. No, we are very honored to have you here too. So, in many of your papers, I was reading, and thank you for sharing all the work that you have done over the years. In many of those papers, you write that the Big Bang of the singularity gave rise to both the physical and biological domains. Now, recently, it has been reported that a star is discovered that is perhaps older than the universe. What do you make of it? What is the impact of this discovery of star and how it impacts our current understanding of science? How do you think that the theory of Big Bang will hold up in the coming years?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I saw that report. It's possible that that's an earlier iteration of the same process. So we're just working our way backwards in space and time. But I do think that for earthly evolution, the Big Bang still seems to hold up. My sense is that science is an ongoing process. It's not hardwired, if you will. It's an ongoing quest for understanding. So as we peel back these layers of information, we have to begin to cobble together a knowledge base. So that's really what my hope is, that with an understanding of evolution from its origins rather than from its ends, as Darwin had done, that we will in fact be able to move forward with a common ground for physics, chemistry, and biology. So yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I hear you. I mean, science is an ongoing process. I mean, today we understand a little bit, tomorrow we'll understand more, day after tomorrow, a little bit more. So and then as we discover more in the universe, our understanding changes. And now this emerging understanding is that the beginning of life on Earth is thought to have been mediated by lipids. In one of your papers, you have written, immersed in the primordial oceans, spontaneously forming micelles as prototypical cells that distinguish the internal and the external environment. Now, again, very briefly, we'll just talk about this new discovery of the star, is that if Big Bang is not the acknowledged progenitor of both the physical and biological realms, what could be? What makes what makes them compatible with one another, cell and the environment? So this star that we discovered that is older than the universe, if that exists, then could there have been another big bang, that could have happened way before, the understanding of the time we had?
Yeah. Again, I mean, there is the multiverse theory that we're in only one of many universes. So if I ascribe to that idea, then maybe this discovery offers an opportunity to see that relationship more as a linear kind of process of one big bang giving rise to another. So again, I think that the contemporary idea of the conventional idea of the Big Bang still is consistent with earthly evolution. On the other hand, perhaps this new star that has been discovered will give rise to a larger platform for an understanding of organic evolution. I don't know, but
Yeah.
at least for me, that idea of, because I am trained as a lipid chemist, amongst other things, it makes all the sense in the world to me that lipids suspended in water form protocells or micelles, and those lipids have an interesting property. They exhibit hysteresis. So the warming and cooling of the oceans and these protocells, losing their form and regaining their form is memory, and memory is essential for evolution. So in that sense, again, I actually am in the process of publishing a paper suggesting that perhaps we can query the unicell and its cytoskeleton in order to understand better physical principles, because we're kind of at a difference with contemporary physics, and maybe the biology will offer a template for understanding the physics, and then vice versa. You can bounce between the two.
Right, right. No, no, that's a very interesting point you made about that memory is essential for the evolution. Now, I think you sent me a paper yesterday to read about that, but I was all day outside and I could not, read that, and I look forward to reading it. But how is memory essential to evolution? So, I mean, we know that whatever memory we form, it stays in the genetic code, and then it passes on to the offsprings. But in the evolutionary process from the very beginning, if we talk about the unicellular organism, do they also go to similar process, and they also can save memory in the very limited amount of genetic code that they have?
Yes, all organisms have memory in the sense that, so I think there's a misunderstanding of what consciousness actually is. I think that consciousness is actually the homologue of the cosmos. So we both the cosmos and our minds and our physiology operate under the same laws of nature. Natural laws form both organic and inorganic, or the existence of matter itself. So for me, the big insight was that I don't think anyone else has suggested this. I'm not a physicist, but it makes sense to me that based upon Newton's third law of motion, when the Big Bang occurred, there had to have been a recoil, a response to that. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And that was necessary for the formation of matter. Otherwise, everything would be energy. So what I'm saying is that that process, that recoil, is the same principle that underlies our physiology as homeostasis. They're one and the same process. So there is a common ground between physical evolution, if you will, from whatever that singularity was, hypothetically, and ultimately how biology has complied with those same set of principles. It only makes sense to me as a human being that that must be true. We just haven't up until now had the opportunity to make that those connections, because as it has been documented by Betty, in the Unity of Biology by Betty Smolkovitis, there is no cell biology in any of the evolutionary literature. And that's a historic glitch, because when the evolutionists were not able to explain ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, or Stremann's organizing principle, which were discovered in the late 19th century, the evolutionists shifted to genetics for lack of any other way of understanding that. And we've never gone back. We've never re-embraced cell biology in evolution. And yet, cell biology is the fundament of both biology and medicine. So there's a huge gap there. And that's what I'm, at least historically, what I'm trying to backfill is that glitch. Because you cannot explain contemporary biology and medicine without cell biology and therefore evolution. So that's what the intent was.
No, that you're absolutely correct on that. That the whole focus was on the genetic code and genome, and there was never any focus on the physiology of the organism. So now uh, it seems that both the physical and the biological domains are mini singularities. You have written in one of your papers. And that is authored by the Big Bang. So, how does it give us understanding of a valid pathway for quantum evolutionary development through cell-cell interactions? How does that work?
So that's the foundation of contemporary understanding of embryologic development. The big breakthrough in my laboratory when I was a PhD student at McGill was that we were studying the effect of a simple molecule, hydrocortisone, cortisol. It was discovered serendipitously to accelerate fetal development, embryonic development, if given to a pregnant sheep in the first studies, and then rats and mice and other laboratory animals. And what we discovered was that the hormone actually didn't affect the cells that the evolved cells that provide specialized function in the lung. It's the epithelial cells that line the alveoli, the little like clusters for oxygenation. So doing cell culture work, we discovered that the hormone actually affected what I refer to commonly as connective tissue cells or fibroblasts. They in turn produce a small molecular weight peptide that in turn stimulates the epithelium to differentiate. That was a huge breakthrough that occurred in the late 70s. My coworker, a physician scientist, published that paper in Science in 1979. So that was the beginning of a fundamental understanding of embryologic development. So that was, and that in turn led me to this. And what I ultimately did 50 years later, if you will, was to turn that around and apply developmental biologic principles of cell communication to phylogeny. So development is the short-term history of the organism. Phylogeny is the long-term history of the organism. And once I stepped back and realized what I had done, I realized that I actually was explaining evolutionary biology based upon cellular principles, no longer based upon genetics, which actually doesn't explain the process. So I don't know if that
Yes, no,
answers your question.
that's an amazing discovery that your lab has made. It gives us so much clarity about how things work. And I mean, as I was reading that the reduction of these embryogenesis to networks of growth factors and their cognate receptors has offered us the opportunity to identify homologies with quantum mechanics, which can further reduce biology to a level that coherently coalesce with the singularity of the Big Bang. So, I mean, there are, lot of the model biological. I was reading that there are a lot of examples that we see in real life. For example, migratory birds, and there is how the reproductive physiology of birds, particularly the effect of ambient light on their pineal gland, which regulates reproductive physiology. So there are a lot of examples that can be seen in the real world. So is there a fundamental difference between the biological traits that we see not only in humans but animals, birds, or any other living organism that can underpin evolution and the process of evolution itself?
Yes, so the reason I raised that scenario of bird migration is because Ernst Mayr so Mayr was the chair of the evolutionary biology department at Harvard. And he published a paper in 1952 stating that you cannot relate the ultimate and proximate mechanisms of biology. They remain disconnected. There are reasons for the mechanisms of physiology, if you will, and independently evolution itself. But at the time, there was no evidence for the interrelationship between ambient light changing seasonally and that driving migratory activity through the reproductive strategy. So he wasn't aware of that. But even to this day, strict Darwinian evolutionists will not try to understand an evolutionary trait or its evolution in the context of what is occurring in the environment and how that impacts on the organism, because the primary tenet of Darwinian evolution is that it's due to random mutation. You cannot. So if it's a random mutation, there cannot be a narrative there. It's just it is. It happened. Cosmic rays, or some other physical event that caused the mutation of some gene that then in turn, yada yada yada. Well, that has never made any sense to me from the day I heard that story, because it doesn't. It doesn't carry. It doesn't. It has no logic to it. But I mean, that was the observation that Darwin made, and those were the tools that he had at the time. But we're way overdue for relinquishing those, that perspective. And yet, I mean, if I submit I've published 100 papers on this subject. If I've tried to submit my papers to the traditional evolutionary literature, and the editors will reject it out of hand. I do not understand biology. I don't understand science. I don't understand evolution. Go away. So there's a very hard line.
Yes.
Evolutionists will not accept other than the traditional Darwinian perspective, because the fear, in my opinion, having attended the integrative and comparative biology meetings for a decade and doing symposia there, I came to the realization that there is a fear that if there is slippage in accepting Darwinian evolution, the default mode is creationism. And that's impossible for a scientist. We cannot go there. So there's this binary, which is not valid. I've demonstrated that. I've shown how and why evolutionary traits, primarily lung development and physiology, because that's my training and that's my expertise, but it transcends that in many ways. I mean, you can demonstrate the validity with regard to thyroid development or kidney development and evolution, I should say. Yeah, so there's plenty of evidence to say that there is a narrative, there is a story, and that narrative is critically important, not only to understand evolution, but also it's the potential basis for preventive medicine, to understand why chronic disease. It's said chronic diseases are exemplified by simplification mechanisms like emphysema. The emphysematous lung looks like a frog lung because it is a frog lung. It has actually devolved to the state in which the frog breathes. Frogs don't have a diaphragm. They force air into basically a bag, if you will, and there are capillaries there to exchange gases. So the reason that people with emphysema have difficulty breathing is because they have reverted to an earlier form of lung phylogenetically and also developmentally. And so my point is that if we understand that, and we understand that there are genetic and structural and functional changes that can be detected before the patient becomes a patient, that is the basis for true preventive medicine, for example. And you can devise ways of detecting that and treating it long before. So you prevent the morbidity, you prevent the mortality. That's true preventive medicine. I hope that made sense.
No, absolutely. I mean, we do. I always look for that kind of preventive medicine, because the preventive medicine that we say today, it just diagnoses, disease markers. And that is not preventive medicine. So we do need to come up with an effective model of preventive medicine. So what you are saying, it makes absolute sense. Now, there are, a lot more variables that comes to understanding not only just the genetic code, but the physiology and how it interacts, how the internal cell environment or the human cell environment or any other living species, how they interact with the outside ecosystem, and what transfers, what communication happens between that, and how it impacts and how it directs whether the growth or developing new traits, or whether it goes towards evolution, or whether it drives extinction. There are a lot of things that we need to evaluate, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. So right now, it seems that life on Earth has been dependent on these quantum processes since its earliest beginnings. And we observe many of these cell-cell interaction as examples of quantum processes that underpins the biological actions. So when we talk about these quantum processes that impacts biological actions, what is that mechanism that drives the biological action? The quantum processes are happening everywhere. So is it we are talking about the quantum processes in nature, in outside the cell environment, or are we talking about the quantum processes that happens within the cell environment?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. So a number of years ago, I stumbled onto a burgeoning cottage industry addressing what's called niche construction, which Darwin had originally observed the fact that earthworms actually retain their aquatic kidneys because they evolved from water to land. And earthworms are able to modify the soil around them in order to do that. And I thought that was kind of trivial, superficial, but then it struck me that what if the original unicellular state actually was the first niche construction? So the internalization of the environment. So this is Lynn Margulis's endogenization theory. Professor Margulis was a professor of mine at Boston University, and it was an important driver for understanding the how the evolution of mitochondria was her big breakthrough from bacteria, for example. So, but my point being that realization that the cell and biology actually is integral with its ecosystem because they're part and parcel of the same process. They are all all the organisms and their environment are intimately interrelated with one another. So that's how you have this interrelationship between the physiology and the physical environment itself. As more than just happenstance. Organisms create their own ecosystems. And if you follow that reasoning, it goes all the way from the unicellular state to Gaia, to Earth, to the Earth Mother idea that Lovelock had sponsored, because there's this progression from the very, very smallest to the very largest scales. And in fact, Nicholas Christakis at Yale is an epidemiologist. He's described how in human systems the same thing happens. He's described it as he calls it his contagion theory, but I think it's the same thing I just said. So there are intimate relationships between the biologic and the physical environment that are more than just associations. So when Darwin traveled to Tierra del Fuego on the Beagle, in the opening lines of The Origin of Species, he describes in great detail the topography of South America at its southern tip. And I think he understood that there must be some relationship there, but he didn't have the science to explore that further. I know he was right. It's what I just described to you. And for that reason, we have to. So for a classic example of the internalization or endogenization is the fact that iron atoms are at the core of the heme protein that allows for gas exchange. Well, iron is a very strong oxidizing agent. And what probably happened was there was a stage in evolution at which probably in the water to land transition where you had to be able to air breathe. And so the heme protein and hemoglobin evolved during that transition in a way where it's very existential and pragmatic to merely internalize and compartmentalize things that would otherwise have killed us off. And there are many examples. Heavy metals are a classic example, but there are ions, gases, bacteria themselves as mitochondria. So our insides are the environmental outsides. It's what Bernard called the milieu intérieur, what Cannon referred to as well as in his writings about physiology and homeostasis. So we recognized this for many years. In fact, the Greeks probably recognized it back in the 5th century BC. So it's a well acknowledged phenomenon. I just came along and was able. There were enough data there to be able to assimilate this information in a way where there actually is experimental evidence and a logic ultimately for all of that.
Right, right. Now that's a very good point you made. Now, since quantum effects, I was reading your papers that quantum effects of oxygen and gravity on cell biology is now well recognized, and I also did, further research on that. So, what do you think is the evolutionary effect of the increased exposure to electromagnetic spectrum on evolutionary biology? What will it do to its cell members? Because every the whole electromagnetic spectrum is not uncommon. We had it, we have it over our entire life, but now there is an overload of it because of the digital, I mean, all these computers and computing and the 5G and all these networks developing. There is a bombardment of electromagnetic spectrum now, both ionizing as well as non-ionizing. So I try to do research and try to find out if anybody has done work on this to understand what would be the impact of electromagnetic spectrum on the biology. Like, how would it impact human cells? How would it impact, animals, birds? And I couldn't find much details on it. But if we have to make an hypothesis right now, what do you think could happen if there is a large amount of electronic spectrum around, humans, like inside the house, outside the house, near the cell towers? What could it do to the human cells or any other living species cells?
Well, I think that the reason you couldn't find much of anything in that regard is it either falls within the purview of radiation medicine, being exposed to high dose radiation and radiation sickness. But what you're actually alluding to, so I'm familiar with this field from the perspective. So I spent 30 years studying a situation that was mechanically regulated. So when you stretch a cell, the parathyroid hormone-related protein in the lung and the bone will compensate for the gravitational effects. And that goes all the way back to the unicellular state. I was able to show if you put lung or bone cells into microgravity, that actually shut that gene off. And then if you put it back in unit gravity, it turned back on. Others at Boston University have shown that if you put yeast into microgravitational conditions, that the yeast, first of all, cannot execute a calcium flux, and it furthermore cannot reproduce. So basically, the yeast cell becomes comatose. It's like a zombie. But that tells us that there's a very intimate and close relationship between gravitational force, for example, and biology. It's fundamental. It's called mechanotransduction. But when you then talk about electromagnetic effects, my point being that you have to be able to understand the arc of evolution in order to understand at what point there was some adaptive response to electromagnetic forces. Because to do it en face, synchronically, directly, that's not the way it works. Evolution is a spatial temporal arc. It's a diachronic mechanism. It's not a synchronic mechanism. That's the contribution I've made, is to understand that in fact you have to understand the spatial and temporal relationships at the cellular level in order to begin to understand these properties that have allowed for adaptation to electromagnetism, for example, or light, for example, the adaptation of the eye to changes in ambient light, particularly in the transition from water to land. There's a huge leap there, and there you see, for example, interestingly, that oxytocin, the posterior pituitary neural hormone that allows for uterine contraction and letdown and milk and breastfeeding, also was responsible for the evolution of color vision in the eye. So it's called a pleiotropic mechanism. But you have to tease this all out as a function of the comparative anatomy, if you will, in molecular biology, of which there is some, but there needs to be more. But we haven't been thinking about these processes in these terms. I took comparative biology when I was a sophomore in college, and they actually did away with that subject because they didn't see any value in it. There's huge value. But it's just a matter of how we look at the problem.
Right. But I think now it's time that we focus on that because several things could happen. One is that This is very, I mean, before that, it's very interesting. I was reading one of your paper that the unicellular organisms, they have an ability to create an external environment around them to protect them from whatever, is happening in the environment. And I was thinking why we humans don't have that ability as we evolve, and the unicellular organisms can protect themselves by creating a shell around them to protect themselves. But we humans, we don't have that ability. And that is something, that I'm trying to understand why we don't have that ability. Because, yes, we are much more complex, organisms, if we look at it, think from that perspective. But now, when we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, several things could happen. One is that some of us, develop an ability to handle large amount, to do we will do just fine when we are exposed to large amounts of this electromagnetic radiation. And perhaps, we will develop certain, traits that would uh, help us, to adapt that. But there also could be large amount of human population that will succumb to that, and they will go towards perhaps extinction, or we will, something else could happen. We will, technology can we can develop another technology that would neutralize the electromagnetic spectrum, so we wear that, and we will be safe from it. So it would be interesting to see how these advances happen, and what would happen to the human body. Because the reports that I read, there is so much fear about the electromagnetic spectrum, especially about the 5G, being rolled out everywhere across nations. That what is it going to do to humans? What is it going to do to birds? And there are a lot of reports emerging that, large amounts of birds, they lose their ability to navigate, and they are, there are a lot of challenges developing. So I hope that, we can develop further research in this area, because it's very important that we understand what we are doing. Because if we develop these large amounts of ionizing, non-ionizing radiation, how human species is going to react? Is it going to evolve and become much more stronger, or is it going to go towards extinction, develop a lot of, radiation related diseases? So that is something that is worth investigating. But since such epigenetic interactions between biology and the environment can be considered as self-referential echoes of the origins of life, do you think we can use it to understand the evolutionary or existence pattern of the impact of not only this EMP spectrum, but any other emerging technologies like nanotechnology, smart dust, and so on? Because the nanotechnology is emerging rapidly, and smart dust is coming our way. So what will happen? The smart dust will be just like dust particle. We won't even see it, but it's going to be there in our environment. So how will human body react to that? Because whatever happens outside will happen inside our body as well. So is there any development in understanding about this nanotechnology field and what it will do to human body?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, again, I think that it has to be seen historically to understand how organisms early in invertebrate evolution specifically coped with electromagnetic forces, for example, or some way of reducing the question of nanotechnology to make it, to see it in the context of physiology. But at the earliest stages in which change occurred, because it's there that you recognize the genetic, physiologic, cellular interrelationships that then can be seen in a prograde fashion to understand what are the physiologic traits that we now recognize in contemporary physiology. That's the only way in my mind, to logically approach the question you just asked. But I think it's a very good one. And my guess is that there must have been ways in which unicellular organisms coped with electromagnetic forces. We just don't recognize them because they're so ancient and they're buried in our physiology, but they do emerge from time to time. We just don't recognize it as such because we're not thinking of it in those terms. As I said earlier, the idea that simplification mechanisms of chronic disease are just that. Well, no, there actually is a logic to that. So the second book we published, Evolution, the Logic of Biology, is predicated on that idea that there is a logic. We just have made things so we've complexified things to such a degree that we don't even recognize means and ends.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem. I actually wrote a paper. So in my laboratory at UCLA, we do epigenetic research. The likelihood, not only likelihood, the scientific evidence that Lamarck was correct, that we do acquire information directly from the environment. So that's probably the black matter of biology. So it's maybe in that context, in an epigenetic sense, for example, that electromagnetic effects might be understood, for example. But that whole cottage industry is rapidly emerging, and I think will answer a lot of otherwise dogmatic or unanswerable questions in biology.
Let's hope so, because ideally, I think that it would be great if we as humans are able to adapt to large amounts of radiation, because it will prepare us for coming tomorrow in case we have to go to other planets and we have to make home there, and there could be large amounts of radiation on other planets. So ideally it would be great for human body to adapt and be able to handle large amounts of radiation. But also, there are also complex challenges about the diseases and all that. So let's see what happens in the coming years. But I'm sure that there is a need for a very systematic study about what impact this radiation does on human body, this EMP spectrum. So we will see, how it goes forward. But it is said that a quantum world is a radically interconnected, interdependent world where every entity, from, if you look at a elementary particle to galaxy, evolves like an organism, entangled with all there is in the nature. And in absence of entanglement as quantum coherence, even waving our arms would not be possible. This is from one of your paper. So can you explain how human thoughts or muscle contraction or anything that happens to human body, irrespective of this, which emerging technology is coming our way, how is that going to create an impact on the quantum processes and quantum entanglement? Because if everything is interconnected, what happens within human body, within human cells, would also impact what happens in the environment. So it will also impact the quantum processes. What do you think could happen?
So I start from the fact that life began as an ambiguity. So based on Schrodinger's book about what is life, which he published in 1944, he laid claim to the idea that the internal entropy, energetic hierarchical relationships are actually negative within the cell and positive outside of the cell. So right there is an ambiguity, which, for example, allows us to physiologically cope with the uncertainty principle that Heisenberg had developed. So the uncertainty is coped with because we are an ambiguous construct, if you will, for example. Or for that matter, the fact that Pauli exclusion principle, which explains the spin of electrons. There are 4 variables, 3 of which are deterministic and 1 is actually probabilistic. Similarly, in my reduction of physiology and back, if you will, using a sort of a Russian doll or what Gould had referred to as exaptation. So the idea that any given new trait is actually derivative of some genetic principle that was used earlier in the history of the organism. This is where history comes into evolution. So in that sense, we understand. So what I realized was that there actually are first principles of physiology. So I reduced it to negative entropy, chemiosmosis, which is basically how the bioenergetics of the cell are able to maintain a negative entropic state, because that is defying the second law the second law of thermodynamics. Because energy normally is dissipated in a space, in a given space, whereas in biology, in the cell, it is retained within the mitochondria and other organelles until you die. So this is how we cope with, and furthermore, so that's a determined, and so negative entropy, chemiosmosis, and the third component of the first principles of physiology is homeostasis. Okay, so both negentropy and chemiosmosis are deterministic. Homeostasis actually allows for a probabilistic allowing of the organism to exist physiologically within a certain range, which it evolves to, if you will. Obviously, if you transgress too far in terms of the physical principles involved, you become extinct. But so you have both in quantum mechanics and in biology, in cell physiology, you have both deterministic and probabilistic elements. That, to me, explains why we exist the way we do. We are able to accommodate the physical world through these principles, if you will. We are actually, because of the homologies between quantum mechanics and cell physiology.
Yes, no, understood.
But beyond that, in terms of entanglement, my gestalt with regard to entanglement is, because I'm trained also as an endocrinologist, is that, so there's the principle of pleiotropy. For example, the classic example is you have crystalline protein in the lens of your eye because it remains, the lens remains clear because of it. But there's also crystalline protein in your liver. How does that work? There are many examples of what's called pleiotropy. The same gene used over evolutionary history for different purposes. And under stress conditions, for example, when you have an endocrine burst, it integrates those pleiotropic mechanisms to create a physical chemical field. That's entanglement in biologic terms. It's the same idea as entanglement in physics. So yeah, there are these homologies at the very smallest and the very largest levels and everything in between. That's how I think of the interface between the physical or physics and biology. But again, you have to see it in a spatially, temporally appropriate way. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So classically, there have been physicists who've attempted that, but they haven't gone to that level of reductionism and particularly understanding development as the short-term history and phylogeny as the long-term history of the organism.
Yes.
That's a totally different way of thinking.
Yes, very true, very true. Now, it seems that math underlies the dynamics of natural systems, and it drives the evolution of phenomenon via basic function that repeats itself across all levels of time and space, producing self-similarity on all levels of inspection. So, what is the correlation with the man-made artificial systems that we are building currently? Like, we build cyberspace, and in the coming years, we will build other spaces. So, how does math help us explain man, machine, matter, and Mother Nature existing together?
I'm sorry, you're asking about mathematics.
Yes.
Got it. So Peter Rowlands is a mathematician at the University of Liverpool with whom I've been dialoguing, and Peter has actually developed a whole new mathematical construct to understand the fundament of physics. And what I glommed onto in his theoretical approach is that zero did not exist in the mathematical system until about 1000 AD. So the Arabs introduced the concept of zero. And Peter refers to that as an attractor. So the fact that zero exists in the mathematical system gives meaning to the ones and zeros of computer mathematics, for example. Without that, it's meaningless. Similarly, as I just earlier, a few minutes ago, referred to, negative entropy is also, it's actually a negative energetic state. But if you eliminate negative numbers, it actually is zero. So the cell actually is also an attractor. So there's a homology there between the numerical numbering system and the biology, if you follow my reasoning. I think that that's why there's a commonality between mathematics and biology. And people exhort people like me to try and mathematically express these concepts that I've been describing. I've been trying. I've gone through at least, 3 mathematicians now. And I was hoping that maybe the categorical approach that you discussed in one of your previous interviews might be an opportunity. I reached out to Dr. Baez, but he didn't respond. I don't know if it was an actual email address or not. At any rate, I do think that there is. I do think that the way that I have constructed the whole entity of a cellular biologic approach to evolution is amenable to mathematical analysis. In my mind's eye, it's probably something like a Turing automaton with an actual brain, if you will, something that allows the automaton to sense what's going on in the environment, interpolate that, extrapolate that, interpolate that, based upon a memory base that is servoed to its historic experience, or it can create that. So I do think that there are paradigms already, mathematical paradigms that lend themselves to this. It's just a matter of finding somebody. It's an interface problem, really. That's sort of a glib way of sort of writing it off. But I do think it's feasible, and I think it's essential that we develop an algorithm like that for all the attendant reasons. Because you were alluding earlier to why it is that we humans are unable to fend for ourselves. Well, that's because we created societies that created the space in which we could be creative. I always feel vulnerable if I don't have protection around me. It's impossible to be creative in an unprotected and insecure environment. So so I do think that it would behoove us to develop an algorithm that. And in fact, I had written a paper back 15 years ago, which was published in a small journal, alluding to the possibility that there is biology. And it was only recently that I realized that idea is very viable because Eric Sherry, he's in the Department of Chemistry at UCLA, writes about the periodic table, expressed the idea that Mendeleev didn't just use a cute denominator, the atomic number, to normalize the elements in order to organize them. He also appreciated the chemistry of those elements and how to fine-tune those relationships. That idea that I think it's all about empiricism, whether it's chemistry or physics or biology, it's always something on the left-hand side of the equal sign, changing it to something on the right-hand side of the equal sign, and as a matter of energy and mass, changing their relationships. E equals mc squared is pervasive. That's the way, and I think that's the way. So the empirical principle is really what drives everything. It's actually what Alfred North Whitehead was postulating in his theory of existence, if you will. He thought that everything was energy. Matter was really an artifact of collisions of energetic states that generated matter, but it was transient.
Yes, everything is energy. You're absolutely right. And the point that you made about developing that algorithm to understand how everything is, interconnected, that is a necessity. And I hope that in the coming years, if not us, that someone else is able to develop that. But biology and trained energy via semi-permeable membranes promotes the reduction in entropy. That is the metabolic driver for evolution as a way of perpetuating self-organizing homeostasis. So, is it possible to propose some specific linkage between each and every human across nations, that how they are interconnected and how what happens to one human, or humans in one nation, how it impacts other humans across nations, because everything is interconnected. If biology and physics are interconnected, I'm sure that all humans are interconnected. So there must be a way to prove this scientifically, by developing some kind of algorithm to understand that how all humans are interconnected and interlinked, and how what happens to one human somehow impacts any other humans as well. Are you aware of any research that has been done on this area, or there is
Yeah, I mentioned earlier Christakis. Nick Christakis he refers to as his contagion theory because he works in medicine. So the homologue for him is a contagion process, Ebola or, something, the plague, whatever, that there are these patterns. And he's actually developed a computerized description of how societal subsets interrelate with one another. He's demonstrated that. I guess the key would be, and I've tried to reach out to him to collaborate, because then the trick would be to relate that computerized algorithm to the underlying, for example, the genetics. You start with some genetic interrelationship that actually predicts that phenomenon, because it is a phenomenon that he's describing. The trick is to understand the mechanisms underlying those interrelationships, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yes,
It isn't easy, but I think that it could be done in a systematic, stepwise fashion, where you take some classic example and you phase that in, and then you piggyback onto that other things that are related to that particular primary phenomenon.
Yes.
So I think it's feasible. It's so terribly difficult to find people like you, for example, who are able to transition from one, intellectual silo to another. Because we're trained in reductionism to the point where, certainly in biology, it makes no sense. Once you transgress the cell membrane, you're not talking about biology anymore. You're talking about chemistry and physics. So that's why it doesn't work. You have to respect those boundaries, because that's where the magic comes out. That's where the mystery of of life, the animus, is in the space between the cells. Right? I don't mean to sound too ethereal about this, but so I love the Robert Frost quote in one of his notebooks. He said, "Life is that which can mix oil and water." He was right. The question is what is the mechanistic explanation? And there are problems there, because I've been in communication with an Indian Hindu scientist for a number of years, who writes about consciousness, and he took me to task saying, "Well, you talk about heliocentrism only being recognized for 500 years. The Hindus have known that for 30,000 years." And I said, "Yeah, but where's the science?" Because and I don't mean to be authoritarian or hubristic about that. I think it's important to understand the science, because that's how you find the interconnections between heliocentrism and other cultural and scientific phenomena. Without that, if it's only a belief, it's only a belief. It's a standalone. It doesn't allow for that integration that I was referring to.
Yeah, and understanding this from scientific perspective is important, because if we understand, then we know how to develop these systems that we are developing at all levels, national, local, national, and global, because developing systems that are interconnected, and humans are connected to all those systems. So it's important to understand all these different interconnections so that we develop systems that would actually work. And right now, we don't have systems that takes into consideration all these different variables. So understanding and all these theories, or from a scientific perspective, is very, very essential. So I hear you on that. Now, one question about category theory. I know you reached out to Professor Bays, and I'm not sure why he has not responded. I hope he listens to this and he responds to you. I will send him an email as well and see why he has not responded. But it is the math that underlies the dynamics of natural systems, and it drives the evolution of phenomena via a basic function that repeats itself across all levels of time and space, producing self-similarity on all levels of inspection. So using category theory to understand the singularity of nature would be, very beneficial. So you and I talked about this, through emails, that it would be really good to understand, to use this category theory to, for example, understand what is the impact of electromagnetic spectrum, the radiation on human cells or any cells, so that we understand what would happen over the years to human body or to any other non-human living species. So is it possible to apply category theory as a formal model theory to understand cell-cell signaling applications and to understand patterns of evolution or extinction.
I think so. I mean, I looked at the description of category theory, and I think I understand it. And I would say that, so we already have proof of principle that you can merge physics and chemistry through the periodic table. All you have to do now is, as I've suggested, because I'm saying there's a homology between chemistry, physics, and biology, now you merge the biology with the chemistry and physics in a self-similar kind of algorithm based upon the concept of the periodic table. You have to find a common denominator. I think I've expressed those ideas. It's not simple, but I think it's doable. And wouldn't that be dynamic? If you had a common database for all the natural laws, you could now search, develop a browser that would be able to connect electromagnetism with biologic principles. Once you have enough data, it's a given that you have to have enough data. But I think the data are there. It's just a matter of thinking out of the box as to how those things, as to how to assemble those parts. I've had a close friend, an astrophysicist. When I suggested this to him, he said, "Oh, so biology has valence," which sort of stopped me in my tracks. But biology does have valence, and is demonstrable. So, and we know that there are prototypes for that. So the target of rapamycin gene, for example, that is at the base of every physiologic function that I can think of. So there are precedents for this that could be used in order to scale up this kind of approach, if you will. And ultimately, I think certainly the biology is scale-free. And I think the physics and the chemistry are scale-free too. It's just that there is a human signature in our understanding of chemistry and physics, which has to be factored out. That's really my dream, is that if we could accomplish what I'm talking about, and we could understand the biologic premise, which is not food, shelter, and reproduction. That's descriptive biology. But the kinds of things I'm talking about, which are highly mechanistic, you could factor out the human subjectivity in order to understand the chemistry and physics in its purest form, in order to really understand how all of these things merge together in a common database.
Yes, yes, yes. Now I hear you on that. By reducing the development and phylogenetic history of any living organism to cellular molecular common denominator against the backdrop of global environmental variables, the causal relationship for evolutionary change, it seems that we are very close to finally understanding that. So, how do you see this developing understanding helping us make sense of the technological tsunami we see today that is fundamentally reshaping the human ecosystem in all these different spaces: cyberspace, aquaspace, geospace, and space?
Well, I think that we tend to develop technologies just because we can. I mean, I expressed in a paper on the central theory of biology that it all emerges from the fact that we're warm-blooded, and because we're warm-blooded, and birds are too, that gave rise to walking on two legs, bipedalism, that freed our forearms to do specialized things like flight or tool making, which in turn forced a positive adaptation for language and oral and written language. So we are the product of this systematic and sequential change in our physiology, which gave rise to a very large central nervous system, which allowed for creativity to make tools that violate that basically are all tools that violate the principles of physics. Simple machines do that. They make us more efficient. But in so doing, we have forgotten to constrain our activities in a moral sense, because we're the only organism on the planet that's destroying it. Why is that? I think it's because we haven't come to this state where you and I are talking about, where we realize the causal, the ontologic and epistemologic principles that are involved, so that we self-impose those constraints. We have to, because we cannot go on like this. We have dwindling resources. We have an ever-increasing population, dwindling food resources. We did this once before, the Enlightenment. But at that time, there were fewer people, a lot more resources. And I think that what we're experiencing is the tailing off of that momentum of the Enlightenment. We need the Enlightenment 2.0 desperately. And I think, again, that we have to be reflective about why we are doing what we're doing and why it is that we are not good stewards of the environment.
Yes.
My sense is that if we, just like taking the Earth out of the center of the solar system and putting the sun in the center, which gave rise to the Enlightenment, we need to take ourselves out of the center of the biosphere. Every organism is conscious, in my opinion.
Very true. I hear you.
Every organism adapts to its own environment. We happen to be warm-blooded, so we're not constrained by environmental constraints. But in reality, we still have to comply with the laws of physics, ultimately, or pay the penalty. That's what's happening, to be glib about it. So, yeah, and I don't like to be preachy, but I see the forest for the trees at this point. And it took me a long time to realize, why it was that 50 years as a funded investigator, I was chasing my tail. I really was merely providing a description of what was going on, not actually understanding the origin, the fundamental origins of physiologic principles that allow for understanding life and death and disease. So medicine is, one of the Democratic candidates said we're not practicing healthcare, we're practicing sick care. This is a very bad trend.
Very true. I agree with you on that totally. And it is time that we go back to nature, understand its principles, and follow that, because every action has equal and opposite reaction. So we need to understand that the decisions that we are making today, what is going to be its effect for the coming tomorrow. Because at the end of the day, we need to think about the future of humanity. We cannot live reckless life the way we are living, just developing anything and everything that we want to do without understanding how it will hurt the environment, how it will hurt the human species, because we are doing all these developments, technology developments, for the benefit of humanity. And if the humanity is not going to benefit, then that we need to take a pause and reevaluate our strategies. So having said that, what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners, especially about your books, your initiatives, your research, where you are going, and especially those brilliant young minds that are out there who wants to make a difference? What would you like to tell them?
Well, so I've been asked that question. I've lectured about this concept for many years. The question that usually comes from the graduate students in the audience is, well, how do I do what you do? The reality is that it takes, you have to be able to think somewhat imaginatively, the way that I have, to understand the ultimate relationships that we try to ferret out using very high level tools. But the reality is, as Einstein said, imagination is far more important than technology. So the problem is I can't get funded to do the kind of work that I actually did develop an experiment that would have been proof of principle, but just didn't have the resources to do it. But my point being, cut to the chase, that many times we do experiments, especially in cellular molecular physiology, where we delete a gene and all of a sudden that's how I got funded for 30 years to study parathyroid hormone-related protein, because the alveoli didn't form in these mice when they were newborn. They died of pulmonary insufficiency. That was totally unexpected. So we have these serendipitous, counterintuitive, gee whiz kinds of observations, and we don't know how to interpolate them into the body of knowledge, because the knowledge base is not based upon the kind of thinking that I've been applying. So I exhort people that I talk to, if they ask the question you just asked, to think about the arc of evolution, and to, even though you can't actually get funded to do that kind of work, at least you can interject the observation that you've made into a different body of knowledge, and that allows for, you sort of have to finagle the bagel, if you will, but you can do that. I did it, and I think others can too. It's just a matter of thinking out, realizing there is a box. That's huge. And then once you realize that you're in a box, get out of it. Use your imagination. So that's the message, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
imagination is more important than intelligence, I guess, so you are absolutely right on that. So thank you so much, Professor Torday, for participating in Risk Roundup today. We appreciate your contribution to the field of evolutionary biology and helping us understand the need to adhere to nature's principles and the singularity of nature. And our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided today and hopefully take the first step towards educating themselves about cause and effect. We thank you for that.
And thank you. Thanks for doing this. Okay.
Professor Torday. So, Risk Roundup, a global initiative launched by Risk Group, is a security risk reporting for risk emerging from existing and emerging technologies, technology convergence, and transformation happening across cyberspace, aquaspace, geospace, and space. We at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace, they walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. And it is not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security. So, if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, it will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. So, let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the risk roundups, to other risk roundup video audio podcasts, please go to riskgroupllc.com and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.